ladies and gentlemen. I first wanted to start off by acknowledging traditional owners of the land upon which we stand, sit, crawl, whatever, today. In many ways, talking about Israeli Apartheid Week, one could feel quite depressed. One could look at the recent meeting between Obama and Netanyahu in Washington a few weeks ago and find the Palestinians ignored entirely. In fact, in most of the public statements, both at AIPAC, which is America's leading Zionist lobby group, and at the meeting publicly between Netanyahu and Obama at the White House, Palestinians didn't really get mentioned. Which, of course, from Israeli's perspective would be seen as a wonderful success. It's all about Iran, the danger of Iran, and supposedly how Israel needs to, or America, or anyone else needs to stop Iran's supposed nuclear weapons, etc. So on one hand, you could argue things are pretty grim. On the other hand, I would argue that, in fact, the reality is that the discourse on this subject has changed so fundamentally since I started talking about this about 9 years ago as to be unrecognisable. Let me give you a few examples about why I think this is the case. The Australian Jewish News, that wonderful newspaper, had an editorial a few weeks ago, actually it was last year, but it could have been relevant this year as well, talking about Apartheid Week in 2011. And this is what it said. Students across Australia set to rally against so-called Israel Apartheid next week. No one is pretending that there aren't problems or prejudices in Israel, just as there are in every other country. But official segregation, the deprivation of civil rights, the white-only hospitals, schools, universities and beaches, the restrictions on unemployment, the mass resettlement, the hallmarks of South African apartheid are all absent. What's almost humorous about that editorial is that every single human rights report from the UN, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, pretty much any human rights group in the world has actually found the opposite of that. For the last 10 to 15 years, look at any report, any of those organisations. So the idea somehow there is what can only be described, ladies and gentlemen, as a ghetto mentality that exists in much, sadly, of the established Jewish community that refuses to see the reality. Another good example here from a few weeks ago, in Yediot, which is Israel's leading newspaper. I use the term leading advisedly, the most popular, I should say. This is what this writer said, and I quote, "Zionism will only cease being demonised in the politically correct corners of the West once our schools and film industry cease to demonise colonialism. The politically correct depiction of the colonialist as a racist and brute must give space to the majority of well-meaning administrators that helped build roads, schools and hospitals for the natives." His words, not mine. "It must be shown that colonialists administered law and justice far more fairly than most pre-colonial chieftains or post-colonial despots. It must be taught that human development indicators plummeted in the majority of African and Asian countries following independence." He goes on, "Once an honest discussion about colonialism is tabled, hostility to Zionism will wane in leftist circles." Optimistic. "Not because they will shed the belief that Zionism is a form of colonialism, but because it will be possible for them to appreciate the merits of Zionism." Now, the remarkable thing about that kind of discussion, which is incredibly, I would argue, common in much of mainstream Jewish thought, is how utterly removed from reality it is. If you listen to the vast majority of Jewish organisations, Jewish spokespeople, the US President, the Australian Prime Minister, the list goes on, you find a profound disconnect between what's actually happening on the ground and what's actually happening in reality. And why that I think is important is that politically, as I started off my talk, politically things in terms of so-called negotiations between Israel and the Palestinian Authority are going nowhere. Everyone has known that for at least 15 years, including the PA. And although it's quite sad and pathetic to watch Mahmoud Abbas, the so-called illegitimate Prime Minister of Palestine, consistently talking about how he's opposed to settlements, he knows, and we know, that the PA only exists to manage the occupation. That's its key role. That's why it was set up, that's why it's funded, including by Australia. We give millions and millions every year to the PA to manage the occupation. It's not, of course, said to be that, but that's essentially what it is. So the discourse is shifting. And I want to give you a few examples, particularly from overseas, in the US especially, about why, although politically things are quite grim, if Obama wins re-election in November, or, almost humorously, Rick Santorum or Mitt Romney, things politically aren't going to be going very far. But in terms of the discourse, things have profoundly shifted. Let me give you a few examples. 2 weekends ago in Harvard, there was a conference about the one-state solution. And a colleague of mine, a friend of mine, was one of the key organisers of that. He's a Palestinian American. And the conference brought together a range of academics, thinkers, writers, mainly from the US and from Europe. Not only people who supported one state, some indeed who believed in 2 states but didn't think it was actually going to happen. And the response by both the political elites and much of the mainstream media was apoplexy. Essentially this was supporting Nazism, it was the end of Israel as a Jewish state, etc., etc. And I thought the best, most interesting comment about that was written by Caroline Glick, who is, for those of you who don't know, a columnist for the Jerusalem Post, who is pro-settler and arguably a Zionist fundamentalist who, of course, was republished openly and beautifully in much of the Western Jewish publications. This is what she wrote after she'd heard about this conference. I looked out the window of Jerusalem and all I could feel was thankful to be living in the independent, free Jewish state of Israel. This is, of course, the minor problem and the fact it's a client state of America. We're putting that issue aside. I am thankful that those pseudo-intellectuals no longer can determine the future of my people as they could in the 1930s. I am thankful that my children will in all likelihood not study in US universities, but in Israeli ones that are not as demented as their American counterparts. And she closes with this. For me, the message is clear enough. As a Jew, a Jewish mother, and a person who clings to my freedom, guns, and religion, my job is to do everything I can to ensure that Israel remains strong and gets stronger so that today's corrupted elites can't touch us. End quote. The conference itself that happened at Harvard was successful. The one-state solution hasn't quite happened yet, that's true. But the debate at that conference brought in a range of speakers, and the coverage, I think, was very instructive. Most of the mainstream media coverage of this conference wasn't about what was being discussed. That was almost seen as irrelevant. What was being talked about very, very clearly was the profound fear that discourse will shift from engaging in the rhetoric of a 2-state solution. If the mainstream, politically, media, and the Israel lobby can continue the illusion of an idea that we're engaged in a peace process, this could go on for years. It's already been going on for 20 years. And the result on the ground in Palestine, putting Gaza aside for a second, which we shouldn't, is that in the West Bank now there are up to 700,000 Jewish settlers. We don't know an exact figure, between 5 to 700,000. All there utterly illegally under international law. Most of them, in fact, are illegal under Israeli law, putting aside international law. So the idea somehow there's going to be an equitable 2-state solution is delusional. And that's, of course, the point. If you continue with the illusion of negotiations and the illusion of Israel, the Palestinian Authority, America, the client states like Australia who kind of follow along whenever they get told, you can believe somehow that if only the Palestinians accepted Israel, peace would come. And that's exactly what we hear time and time and time again from the vast majority of spokespeople from Israel and its courtiers in the American and Australian press. There was an interesting article in The Economist a few days after the Obama-Netanyahu meeting a few weeks ago. And I thought the description of the relationship between the US and Israel was quite apt, so I wanted to read it to you. It's very short. The American-Israeli relationship now resembles the sort of crazed codependency one sometimes finds in doomed marriages, where the more stubborn and unstable partner drags the other into increasingly delusional and dangerous projects whose disastrous results only seem to legitimate their paranoid outlook. If Mr. Netanyahu manages to convince America to back an attack on Iran, it is to be hoped that the catastrophic consequences will not be used to justify the attack that led to them. A few other quick points before I finish. And to prove my point, the discourse is shifting. 2 weeks ago, there was a major piece in Forward. Forward is one of America's leading Jewish publications, hardly a one-state pro-BDS publication at all. And there was a massive feature about Aryeh Benim, as some people know, he's a Palestinian American. He's arguably the most prominent one-state proponent, supporter of BDS. And the profile actually of him was very sympathetic. And what was remarkable about it was, apart from the fact that the Israel lobby got apoplectic that someone like him would even get coverage in the first place, What he explained was why one state and BDS is growing so massively, particularly in the US and elsewhere, Palestine of course. And he says this: people see that there is really not a two-state solution, there is no peace process. We're at the point where there is nothing left to pin our hopes on, and that is pushing people to say, what are the alternatives to this? And the alternatives are quite clearly a one-state solution. But of course what's remarkable about this is this very interesting point. In the last 2 weeks, in parts of the US, in the South, pro-Israel Christian fundamentalist lawmakers put forward proposals for a one-state solution. Let me explain what I mean by that, because you might think that I'm going mad, but in fact this was coming from individuals who don't believe at all, that Israel should ever give up land to the Palestinians. So therefore it is indefinitely a one-state solution, controlled and run, of course, by Israel. Now the fascinating irony about this is that when you have a growing collusion, as you do in the States, between Christian fundamentalism and an Israel lobby, you have a reality that says that Israel has the right to behave A, as it wants, and B, to colonise indefinitely. The only problem with that rather skewed logic, of course, is that demographically, within less than a decade, if not before then, we have a situation where Palestinians will outnumber Jews. Simple numbers game. And although the discourse in Israel fundamentally comes around the so-called demographic threat, a clearly racist term that says we're going to be swamped by Arabs. And that expression is used consistently in mainstream Israeli publications, daily. Swamped by Arabs. If there is a belief that we're going to have a two-state solution, how? Where? When? And the reason in the last 5 years why BDS and one state has massively grown in popularity is coming from one particular reason. It's coming from within Palestine. Not being directed from outside, it's being led by Palestinians inside Palestine and outside. And why that's important is that a two-state solution, certainly for most of its arguably 20-year history, was being pushed by many forces outside Palestine, apart from the PA, which is funded, trained, armed by us to manage the occupation. I want to finish with one quick point. What is sorely needed in this debate, which is happening slowly in the US, but less so here, are people who are happy in some ways to turn on their people. Let me explain what I mean by that. Peter Beinart, some of you may have heard of. Peter Beinart is a former neoconservative writer who supported the Iraq War. Not someone you would think would be particularly supportive of Palestine. He, in the last few years, has, to some extent, had a bit of an about-face about his politics. And without wishing to go into great detail, still believes in a two-state solution. Okay, we can forgive him for that, maybe. But his key point is to challenge what is happening in the discourse in America, to say, and this is what he says in his new book, The Crisis of Zionism. I would say it's more of a catastrophe. He says it's a crisis. I'll give him that. But he argues very clearly that he says, is the mainstream of America, in the Jewish community and politics, serious about a two-state solution? Because if you are, and you do not condemn what is happening in the West Bank or Gaza, you are guaranteeing a one-state solution, which you say is against your interests. And one quote that he wrote just today, I want to read you. It's easier... There's a general understanding in the American Jewish establishment that even if you don't really support a two-state solution, it's better to say not to say so and instead blame the Palestinians for opposing one. It's more diplomatic that way. It's possible that I've misunderstood these Jewish lobby groups. Maybe they're not against all one state, but just one state that dismantles Israel as a Jewish state. Perhaps one statism that dismantles Israel as a democratic state is fine, although I think that's a widely self-defeating view. And what he continues to say is that unless this debate politically shifts, every single spokesperson who we hear in our press all the time, from Gillard, Israel lobbyists, etc., who talk about peace, actually are contributing to their own country's destruction. And to understand that inversion requires, to some extent, a slight understanding of what's happened in the last 20 years. Whenever you hear in the press, or our politicians, or Zionist lobbyists, or anyone else talk about a two-state solution, the obvious next question is, how? Because it's on the ground, it is now fundamentally impossible. And that means that within 5, 10, 15, 20 years, by default, it may not be just initially, but by default, a one-state solution is coming, and we should support that. Thank you.